So hello, everybody. I'm really excited to be here and excited to see so many people here. As a big tech policy nerd, sometimes it's fine and difficult to find other people who are really into this. And so really excited to kind of meet all of you all and hear more what you're interested in. So as mentioned, my name is Tim Wong. I'm part of the public policy team here at Google. And in addition to kind of sort of introducing what we do and how we can help you, this session is going to be sort of a whirlwind tour of sorts. We want to basically take you through some of the issues that we're thinking about at Google and kind of what are the issues in the kind of 12 to 24-month period that we think are going to have the biggest impact on developers going forward. So specifically, we're going to highlight issues where it's going to have a big impact on sort of app development and also on sort of privacy and security. And most importantly, I talk to a lot of devs who say, well, this is really exciting, but how do I get involved? And so that's the second part of the talk. We'll be kind of talking about sort of open opportunities where you can make a difference on some of these issues. So I think the plan is that we're going to keep it pretty conversational. So it'll be about 20, 30 minutes. We'll kind of go to Q&A. And I'm fully cognizant of the fact that this is actually the happy hour period. So I think we're going to keep it relatively short. And we may just all host drinks afterwards, which I'm getting a thumbs or OK from that guy up there. So I think it's a good thing. So let me go into first a little bit of introduction about myself. So I'm a developer by training. But I've always kind of been interested in the intersection between sort of technology and the internet and sort of culture and society. So I'm the founder of a conference called RaffleCon, which I started a few years back, which the whole idea was to kind of bring together people who were momentarily famous on the internet to talk about the past, present, and future of internet culture. So past guests included Success Kid, like the actual kid, the guy who designed Comic Sans, who apologized, and the dude from 4chan who did not apologize. Around 2010, I got really interested in the idea of automating law and lawyers. I had a lot of friends who were going to law school at the time, and they were getting out and telling me about their job. And I was like, man, it'd be so easy to write software to try to automate that stuff. And so I had this dream about doing this law firm called Robot, and Wong, which would be kind of a law firm that was partially run by robots. I ended up kind of being diverged in that process and started getting really interested sort of in the ways in which law shapes technology. How the rules get made that shape the kind of day-to-day of what developers do, and what people kind of experience in their technology. So that kind of sent me down sort of this other path. So I ended up doing research at this place called the Berkman Center for Internet and Society, interning at this place called the Electronic Frontier Foundation that many of you may be familiar with if you're here in this room, and working for Creative Commons, which is kind of this experiment around copyright. Nowadays, I lead public policy at Google on two major kind of emerging topics. So the first one is machine intelligence. So that's very much tied to kind of the products that we've been working on around sort of AI. So TensorFlow, which you might be familiar with, is kind of our product around sort of open sourcing machine learning tools. As well as kind of the bigger questions around AI, right? What do we think that AI will do to the future of work, right? Or how do we guarantee that AIs will be safe in the future as we put more and more things kind of in their hands? Secondly, I also work on VR. That has a product component as well. So I work on things related to cardboard. But I also think about the bigger issue, right? Which is, what does it mean that society is going to experience more and more media through kind of the venue of what is virtual reality? And so these are a set of kind of emerging fronts of activity. And so we're going to actually focus today on things that are going to have more immediate impact. But to the extent that you want to nerd out about these issues, that you're excited about these issues, definitely catch me at the happy hour. I'm always happy to talk about this stuff. So let's just jump into it. So what is tech policy anyways? Like I had this conversation with my mom the other day where she was like, oh, honey, like you're working at Google now. You like actually have a real job. And then she was like, so what do you do exactly? And I'm like, oh, I work at public policy. And she was like, what does that actually even mean? And we meet actually a lot of developers who are like, OK, public policy, like I have like the vaguest sense of what that means. So just to set a little bit of background, I want to talk about what we do, right, and how we kind of fit into this overall picture. And it's useful because it also gives some context to talking about how we can help all of you. So when you say public policy, it can sound really abstract, right? Sort of like a bunch of guys sitting in a room with wigs writing a bill. And it's for sure that these guys haven't heard of LeftPad. They haven't heard of GitHub, mostly because it's 1776. But like generally, that's one image of what people have when they think about public policy. Another one is that it might kind of conjure up visions of like the West Wing or House of Cards, right? And I have to assure you that my life is definitely not that. Like I was joking to Wilson the other day that a lot of my work is just kind of shuffling emails around, which is not as kind of sexy as all that. So In any case, I think most people think about public policy as something kind of existing, particularly if you're a dev, something really kind of outside of the world of technology. And that actually turns out to be kind of a big assumption, right? As someone who kind of formerly worked at a startup, I think the usual idea is that you sort of push code and then stuff just kind of happens in a vacuum, right? Either the system is on or off, right? That's one bit. And the other one is, are more users kind of adopting the technology that you build, right? And those are the only kind of two factors that you're really worried about. And you don't really think about the fact that kind of what you're building is going to get influenced by much larger forces that are out there. So technology really doesn't really think about policy all that much. But sort of the scary thing in our world is that certainly people in policy are thinking about technology all the time. So some of you might be familiar with SOPA-PIPA, which happened a few years back. So the Stop Online Piracy Act or the Protect IP Act, which in a particular great kind of DC-ism, Protect IP, the Protect is also an acronym. So it's kind of this fractal acronym. We deal with a lot of that in our line of work. And that was so important, right, because it would have fundamentally shaped how content is allowed to move around the web and have a big impact on speech, right, the kinds of content that can make it out there. Or you might remember kind of the battles around net neutrality that happened a few years back, right, kind of, and that's a particularly important issue, right, because it actually influences how people can access content, right, and the kind of services they have access to. So what I'm trying to say is actually I think these public policy discussions have an impact on pretty much every level of technology, right? If you're a developer, it's the question of what you can build and launch. If you're a startup, it's a question of what kind of users you can access and how you access them. And as a user, as a consumer of technology, as someone who uses phones and is really excited about technology, it's sort of the question of what you sort of can and can't do on those platforms. So that's kind of the work of public policy, right? There are rules, laws, regulations popping up all the time, and ideas for those things popping up all the time. And there's good ideas, bad ideas, and pretty much kind of everything in between. And so our team basically plays the role of monitoring those developments and figuring out kind of the bigger implications for the ecosystem of which Google is a part. Because in many cases, these decisions not only impact sort of the company, but sort of technology as a whole or the internet sort of network as a whole. And then once we've done that, we actually spend a lot of time telling people about it, right? So that sometimes involves lawmakers who get in touch saying, so how does AI work, right? And we go through the process of kind of explaining what that is. And that's not only just kind of with our products, but also kind of new trends as well. What's out there, what's happening, and should I be concerned about it or excited about it? It also involves speaking to particular groups as well. So one of the things that I lead up is kind of specifically the outreach to developers. And we think that's actually ends up being really, really key because they're a critical part of the ecosystem, right? Most of the exciting things are happening in engineering, in startups, even outside of the sort of big companies. Secondly, they're super influential when they do speak on these issues, right? Because these are people who are kind of directly with the technology, understanding the problems that you face on a day-to-day basis, and really have a sense of what to be concerned about. And then finally, they're actually people that we want feedback on some of the issues, right? In many cases, Google's actually trying to figure out what its position should be itself. And so we've actually started to do much more in terms of trying to reach out to people and say, what's your feedback? What do you think? And what do you think our positions should be on the issues? So it's a particularly interesting constituency, though, because developers are this kind of like great kind of influential voice. But simultaneously, again, if you've done a startup or you're part of a company, right, you actually have little time to pay attention to all this stuff, right? You're just busy trying to make sure that things stay up and operational. And so one of the kind of overall sort of strategies in this space that we're thinking about is how do we kind of lower the costs to people participating? How do we lower the cost to people finding out what's going on, right? Because you can't always be paying attention to the latest bill in Congress. And often it's sort of in dense legalese that doesn't actually make sense and get kind of connected to what you're doing on a day-to-day basis. So what's that mean? All right, so I've kind of rambled on at length about this in kind of abstract way. So there's three things that we're kind of doing on this front that I'll sort of shout out, right? So one of them is kind of sessions like these. We're kind of going all around the world. We did a session in Colombia. We have done a session in London, and we're doing a session here at I/O, where we kind of meet with developers and talk about what we're seeing both internationally and people's home country. So that's the first thing, right? If you are kind of traveling from out of town or you have particular issues that you're interested in, and you would want an expert from Google to come and talk about this stuff, this is something that we can definitely help and do. The second one was actually we're working to kind of share our resources more widely, right? If you are in a country or you have a question about an issue, it turns out there's probably someone within the company that's actually looking and watching at this stuff really closely, right? So we're hoping to be kind of an open resource for developers that are out there to have questions answered or actually get in touch with people who are sort of policy experts on these issues. And then finally, we're sort of kind of experimenting or supporting platforms for people to find out more about public policy and technology, right? So As I mentioned at the very beginning, as someone who's really excited about this intersection, it's almost kind of a kind of nerdery that exists in the broader world of nerdery. So it's sometimes really difficult to find people to hang out and talk about these issues. And so one of the things we've been experimenting is with this thing called /policy. It's basically a Slack instance, really casual, a bunch of developers all around the world who are interested in this stuff, talking about this stuff. And we're kind of using it as a way, potentially, to kind of get more information out in a really casual, sort of lightweight sort of way. So let's jump to it. So I've talked a little about what we do, how we're doing it, and how we can help you all. So let's jump into kind of the actual issues. What is coming down the pipe for the next sort of like 12 to 24 months? And the world is really big, right? So I could talk to you about kind of the coming battles around net neutrality in Latin America. I could talk to you about kind of age rating and app politics in Korea. But there's kind of two that are top of mind for us right now that we think are going to have the biggest impact. And specifically, they're ones where we think developers can make a really big difference. So I think that's one of the reasons we're presenting them today. So the first one I'll talk a little about is sort of the Internet of Things and kind of what we're seeing in the evolving world around security and privacy. The second one is around fragmentation on Android and how kind of fragmentation on the platform is actually starting to intersect with kind of laws and regulations. So we'll go into it. So the first one is we've been thinking a lot about the Internet of Things. And particularly where things are going to end up as this technology becomes more mature and evolved over time. And it's a particularly important space because we think that developers have a chance to kind of set norms for how people think about these technologies in a big way. So context setting first, right? Let's face it, Internet of Things, it's a total buzzword, right? But really kind of all it refers to is the idea that everything kind of big and small is starting to incorporate sort of computers, right? That kind of everything is becoming a computational object in some kind. And so we actually don't think the future is going to be some kind of weird sci-fi universe that's Minority Report style and has screens flying everywhere. This is an image that kind of we commissioned internally to sort of envision what the Internet of Things actually looks like in practice. And one of the immediate things you'll notice is actually there's no screens, right? That we think that actually in practice, devices will sort of be seamlessly integrated into everyday life in sort of patterns and shapes that we know and are familiar with. So that buzzword, Internet of Things, actually doesn't mean a whole lot by itself. Right? But what it refers to is this kind of ubiquity of computation, ubiquity of devices all over the place. And so it raises all sorts of really interesting kind of new concerns. How should devices be secured against people with malicious intent, right? So I was traveling recently, I saw a number of people were like, oh, it's a bike lock that you open with your phone, right? And it feels like if the security there isn't quite right, that could be a real issue. How should devices be made to protect user privacy, right? Insofar as you have devices that are collecting information, how do we give users the power to kind of control the information that they are giving? And then finally, how should devices kind of signal that things are going right or going wrong, right? If the paradigm we think in the future is not going to be screens, right, then the really big question is what are the kind of indicators, user interfaces, all those practices that we need to build in order to keep people secure and also people assured about the products that they're building and interacting with. So with all this, I think there's actually one approach, right? And that approach is pretty old-fashioned, which is to say, let's use the law to shape the behavior of people who make and code these objects. That is to say, many of the people in this room. And indeed, actually, a lot of policymakers are thinking about questions in this space and specifically how rules should look like in this space, right? So, if you're going to launch an IoT product, it has to incorporate these ABCD things. But this picture actually it just isn't just about lawmakers, right? One of the big things is it's a situation where people sort of designing these technologies will have a really big role to play. And the reason for that, the intuition for that, comes from this guy, Larry Lessig, that you might be familiar with. So you might remember him from Creative Commons. So if you've seen the CC logo online, it comes from this guy. More recently, he kind of made a bid to run for president. But he's most known kind of in the technology policy world for kind of thinking about the different forces that can shape behavior. And what he says is, OK, there's kind of four forces you could think about, right? There's the force of law, right, like what's written on the books. There's sort of the force of norms, what people agree to do or what's general practice in a space. There's the force of markets, right, which is like the incentives of people kind of building these products and putting them out into the world. And then finally, there's code. And in certain situations, certain of these levers are going to be more powerful than others in shaping the space. And we think in the Internet of Things, code's going to be particularly powerful. And the reason is because the space is actually moving so fast and the standards are being developed so quickly that what sort of developers and conventions and standards developers land on will have a really big role in shaping the kind of norms and laws that eventually emerge around the technology. So the way we think about it and the way that we're starting to kind of shape up our positioning internally, right, is that if ubiquity is the challenge of the Internet of Things, then trust is sort of the solution, right? If we're interacting in a space where there's lots of devices that look like the devices we're familiar with but don't interact or behave in the ways that we expect, then the big thing is how do we ensure that users have trust in this space? And so we've been thinking about kind of 3 principles that should guide what's happening, right? So one is interoperability, the second one is sort of security and privacy, and the final one is sort of the need for sort of new interfaces. And there's kind of a product dimension to all this, but there's also kind of a policy dimension to all of them as well. So on the product side, you may have picked up some of this going around I/O, right? Certainly around interoperability. Last year at I/O, we launched a thing called Weave, which is sort of an open source standard around kind of communication protocols for the Internet of Things. The second one is sort of security and privacy. We've been porting a lot of the kind of best practices that we have on doing stuff like Gmail sort of into the sort of Internet of Things space. And then finally, the new interfaces stuff, like a lot of the work that we're doing on voice interfaces is exactly kind of tied into this question. So this is something that is still kind of emerging, and it's actually something that we're looking for a lot of developer feedback on, right? No one has all the answers, right? Particularly because this field is still emerging. But kind of people who are closest to the technology are going to have sort of the most practical experience to offer. And so we're hoping to develop these kind of practices into some kind of document or some kind of convention, certainly something that we can kind of take back and say, well, OK, within the field, the emerging field of Internet of Things, here are kind of the protocols and standards that we see emerging in the community and throughout the community. So for what happens next, I think if you're interested in this stuff, we're interested in hearing from you about kind of what you're encountering, the troubles you're encountering, and the solutions you're finding to get around them. Because when we get questions from policymakers saying, hey, well, we really want to maybe think about a regulation or a rule in the space, we ideally want to kind of represent sort of the interests of the community kind of as a whole, as an ecosystem, as we kind of push ahead. So that's the first one. And you may not work on Internet of Things, so that may be somewhat relevant. This one, I think, is a really big one, and I think will probably concern a lot of people in the room, which is about kind of fragmentation. Android and fragmentation, and specifically increasingly how that's starting to intersect with law and sort of regulators and policymakers. I want to talk a little bit about how this actually impacts developers in a really key way, and then what developers can kind of do around it. So for this story, it's worth going back to Andy Rubin and the early days of Android in sort of the ancient days of like the late 2000s, basically 2008. At the time, the idea was, how do you design an open source sort of operating system that works for everybody in the space, right? Like if we're going to launch an operating system, how do we generate adoption? How do we get something that works for OEMs, people designing the phones, app developers, and then sort of the users themselves, right? And the idea was to kind of create and focus on open source as a solution, right? If you have an operating system with sort of common protocols that anyone can pick up and use, but also is flexible enough for people to kind of adapt for their own purposes, it seems to be the best way to kind of generate adoption, right? Because you can sort of customize for whatever particular purpose that you want. And so to quote sort of the immortal words of Pokemon, right, this was super effective. At last count, we have some kind of amazing stats about the state of the Android ecosystem, right? There's sort of more than 400 different manufacturers, more than 1.4 billion sort of Android devices worldwide, and then sort of more than kind of 14 billion sort of paid out to developers, app developers over time. And so this is really great, right? So it turns out that the solution of open source was an amazing way to gain and generate adoption in the marketplace. So this is great, everything problem solved, right? Well, this is the problem, right? As the ecosystem has gotten bigger and bigger, and I actually don't need to tell anyone this who develops for Android in the space, right? The ecosystem is also kind of increasingly fragmented over time. So this is a visualization from a company called OpenSignal, and it shows basically all the device fragmentation in the space. And again, like Protect IP, it's almost a fractal level of fragmentation. Like you could zoom in, and there would be fragmentation in the fragmentation. That's how fragmented it is. So in short, kind of openness was kind of the big strength and the big success for the Android platform, but simultaneously generated a ton of sort of fragmentation in more and more contexts. And so that's a little bit abstract, right? So let's actually translate this to terms that, if you're designing or sort of developing for a phone, you'll understand, right? So there's one big cost, right, which is the cost of ensuring performance and compliance. And ensuring performance across many, many different devices. So Animoca had this image that kind of got passed around quite a lot through the web, showing sort of all the devices they had on hand to ensure that the apps that they're building actually function properly. And one thing we've been starting to tell more people about, I think I can say this now. One thing we've been telling more people about is actually that it actually impacts Google as well. So famously, when we were designing sort of Google Maps, we too also had a cabinet of devices to ensure sort of sufficient kind of performance compatibility across lots and lots of devices. So that's one issue, right? It kind of raises the cost of development. I think if you're interested in security, right, this ends up being another huge issue, right? Android, let's face it, has been sort of faced with security issues prominently in the last year. And it's actually arguably an additional kind of unfortunate outcome of fragmentation. It's hard to push updates. It's doubly hard to ensure that all the devices incorporate sort of the latest patches quickly. And this creates a number of risks for the user, right? Of course, their data becomes at risk. But also impacts the ecosystem more deeply, we think, for sort of developers, right? They have to spend more time to ensure security. And then failures actually can kind of harm their reputation, not only sort of the reputation of the operating system, right? So this is kind of the interesting design challenge that we're in right now, and something that we're thinking really, really deeply about, right? Which is, on one hand, as someone who's a free software foundation donor and like someone who's really excited about this stuff, open source is like the incredibly powerful sort of design feature that allowed the platform to percolate and gain adoption. Simultaneously, interoperability becomes a bigger issue as you have more and more fragmentation. So that has this big probably kind of impact on sort of developers on a day-to-day basis. And we have a couple of levers for dealing with it, right? So one way you can kind of read or think about Nexus is that it's an attempt to give Android a platform where the OS can be uniform. But obviously, Nexus phones are not sort of the most popular phone out there. So by far, the strongest lever I have is actually kind of a relationship with people who manufacture phones, right? They have an impact. They are impacted by fragmentation. And they have an interest in the ecosystem as well. So we make agreements to basically ensure sort of anti-fragmentation in the space to protect interoperability. Now, the worry is that kind of without access to this anti-fragmentation agreement, the Android ecosystem might get sort of even more fragmented over time. And eventually, you can imagine sort of particular devices diverging so much that when you launch an app, it's actually even unclear whether or not the app will run at all across the ecosystem in any big way. We also think the impact may be particularly big on small devs because they don't have the resources to develop, right, and ensure kind of compliance and kind of performance across all these devices. So this is a number of big issues, right? And if you've been reading the news lately, you might know that regulators are actually interested in this specific kind of agreement. And because they have a huge impact on the mobile ecosystem and the app economy. And at issue is the question of whether or not these agreements should be allowed, and if they are allowed, what shape they should take. And these inquiries, I think, give us a good sense to understand kind of what regulators are interested in, and also a chance to talk about kind of like how open source business models work. But it turns out actually what's really interesting that what we're seeing is that actually it's not just about Google, but developers are not surprisingly a big part of the picture, right? So we increasingly hear from regulators that are like, can you put us in touch with developers who are interested in talking about this stuff? Because they're the ones who kind of stand to gain or lose as much from kind of this particular issue. And so it turns out they're actually really interested in hearing from you as well. So I think the overarching question of balancing openness and interoperability is not an easy one by any measure. And it's been actually a problem with every single open source project. If you look at the history of successful open source, this actually ends up being kind of a consistent challenge. But we basically think it's important for people's voices to be heard, right? And so if you're interested in learning more about how to be in touch and how to talk to these folks, I would say just drop a line.